For privacy reasons, the names of individuals involved in this case have been changed. Stay tuned. On a hot summer night in July 1966, Chicago was deep in sleep. On the South Side, a peaceful dormitory for female nursing students became the scene of one of the most horrific massacres in American history. A cold, ruthless stranger crept in from the shadows. Over the course of a few hours, he would destroy 8 innocent lives, leaving behind a horrific nightmare that would never fade. But the horror didn't stop there. More than 2 decades later, a secret prison videotape was released, revealing an even more horrifying truth. The killer showed no remorse. Instead, he boasted about his decadent life behind bars, laughing at the pain he had caused. What turned a man into such a bloodthirsty monster? Was it his nature or the result of a dark childhood? And has the justice system failed to control him? Where every unsolved mystery contains secrets that want to be revealed. Step into the darkness and explore them with us. Don't hesitate to leave a like as an encouragement for us, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to update the most classic cases. Chicago, one of the largest cities in the United States, is an economic and cultural center, but it also faces many social problems, such as rising crime and discrimination. In the South Deering area of Chicago's South Side, there is a small dormitory for female nursing students of Chicago Community Health Hospital. This is a 3-story building, simply designed and located in a quiet residential area. However, the security here is lax, with a simple door locking system, creating conditions for a terrible tragedy to occur. Daniel Scott was born on December 6, 1941, in Kirkwood, Illinois, into a working-class family of 8 children. The 7th child in the family, Scott did not have a peaceful childhood. His father, Henry Scott, was a hard-working and strict but loving railroad worker. However, when Scott was only 6 years old, his father died of a sudden heart attack, leaving the family in poverty and uncertainty. Losing his father was a great shock to Scott. The feeling of insecurity and lack of love from the only man in the family made the boy rebellious and stubborn. This trauma was deepened when, just 3 years later, his mother, Martha Scott, remarried Martin Reynolds, an alcoholic and violent man. Reynolds was a heavy drinker, with a habit of cursing and torturing his stepchildren. Unwarranted beatings and harsh insults became a common occurrence in Scott's new home. The family moved to Dallas, Texas, where Reynolds worked odd jobs. Martha, wanting to protect her children, worked hard to earn money to support the family, but she was completely helpless against Reynolds' abuse. Meanwhile, Scott became more and more rebellious as he grew up. He often ran away from home, lived a life of vagrancy, and began to delve deeper into criminal behavior. During his teenage years, Daniel Scott became a professional thief. Starting with petty thefts in the neighborhood, he gradually moved on to stealing cars and breaking into houses. His arrests and placements in juvenile detention centers only made Scott more resentful and hateful towards society. Having been expelled from school before finishing 9th grade, Scott had no future in his education. He turned to hard, lowly jobs such as construction worker, porter, and hired sailor on ships. However, with his erratic temperament, frequent drunkenness, and quarrelsome behavior, Scott could not hold down a job for long. By the age of 20, Scott had a lengthy criminal record for a variety of crimes, from theft to assault to illegal possession of a weapon. He was arrested several times, but because the charges were not too serious, most of his sentences were probation or short-term detention. During his years wandering around Texas, Scott began abusing alcohol and drugs. He was particularly addicted to amphetamines, which he used to maintain his energy during long workdays on ships. However, his substance abuse only made him more aggressive, out of control, and irritable. Scott's personal relationships were also in disarray. He had been married briefly, But his unstable life, addiction, and violent behavior caused his wife to leave, taking their only child with her. After that shock, Scott became even more ruthless and indifferent to life. In March 1966, Scott was released from prison after completing a short sentence for theft. With nowhere to go, no steady job, and no one waiting for him, he decided to leave Texas. With some money from temporary and illegal jobs, Scott headed to Chicago, where he heard there were more job opportunities, especially in the large industrial areas along the river. But Chicago was not the paradise Scott had imagined. The city was also plagued by high unemployment and social disparity. The low-paying manual jobs Scott found were barely enough to get by. The last time Scott was seen trying to live a normal life was when he applied for a job as a stevedore on the Chicago River. However, his bad temper and drug addiction soon got him fired. Unemployed, homeless, and mentally unstable, Daniel Scott began to plot his terrible crimes. In his mind, the idea of revenge on life for the injustices and suffering he had endured gradually turned into blind hatred. Chicago, with its student dormitories and underserved neighborhoods, became an ideal land for someone like Scott. He roamed the neighborhoods, observing and looking for vulnerable targets. On the night of July 13, 1966, Scott decided to act. With a sharp hunting knife in hand, he walked through the unlocked door of a dormitory for female nursing students, not knowing that that night would become a terrifying nightmare that would shake the entire United States. Chicago, in the summer of 1966, was stifling and muggy. The nursing student dormitory at 2319 East 100th Street was a small two-story house in a quiet neighborhood on the city's south side. Inside were common areas and bedrooms where young female nursing students rested after a day of studying and working at the hospital. At approximately 11 p.m. on July 13, 1966, Daniel Scott, then 24, entered the dormitory through an unlocked back door. In his hand was a sharp hunting knife, which he always carried with him as a tool for intimidating and controlling his prey. Scott walked quietly through the dark hallways, searching for the target he had observed for days. The house now contained a total of 9 female students, all of whom were students or interns at the local hospital. He sneaked into the living room, where 3 students were chatting and relaxing before going to bed. With a threatening wave of the knife, Scott ordered everyone to be quiet and do as he said or die. He forced the girls to gather in a single room, forcing them to kneel in a line on the floor. The victims were terrified, but no one dared to resist. Scott, his eyes red from alcohol and drugs, tied each one up with strips of torn clothing and bedsheets. He said in a cold, gruff voice,
"If you stay quiet, you'll be fine. If you don't, you'll all die."
Scott continued to search other rooms and found more sleeping girls. They were all herded into the main room, forming a group of 9 people who were held captive under the threat of a knife. Over the course of several hours, Scott carried out a series of brutal acts. He deliberately attacked each victim, taking them out of the common room to separate rooms and killing them. Scott's madness and bloodlust were uncontrollable. Each time he finished with a victim, he returned to the main room, chose the next one, and continued the horrific process. The cries for help, crying, and begging were all muffled by fear and helplessness. Not only did he attack the girls inhumanely, but he also expressed sick pleasure through each action. Scott's psychology at this time completely fell into a state of paranoia and hysteria. In his delirium, Scott even told the victims that he did it because he wanted to take revenge on life, and that no one can stop him. Those words were like sharp blades stabbing into the minds of innocent girls, making them even more desperate. In the midst of that scene of death and despair, only one person found a chance to survive. Elena Garcia, 23, a nursing student from the Philippines, quickly hid under the bed while Scott was busy attacking the other victims. She lay still, trying to regulate her breathing and praying in the dark. Elena could clearly hear Scott's footsteps moving around the house, her friends' weak screams and cries for help, but she knew that if she spoke or moved, death would come to her immediately. Scott stayed in the house for many hours, leaving behind a horrific tragedy of 8 female students brutally murdered. When Scott left the dormitory, Elena Garcia dared to crawl out of her hiding place, exhausted and panicked. She immediately ran out of the house, trying to call the police with all her remaining strength. Elena Garcia became the only surviving witness to the massacre. Despite being severely traumatized, she still managed to give an accurate account of what happened that terrible night. In particular, Elena clearly remembered one important detail: the distinctive tattoo on Scott's arm that read "Born to Raise Hell." This was the most important clue that helped the police quickly identify the perpetrator. Daniel Scott's image and identifying features spread throughout Chicago, and within a few days, he was arrested at a local hospital after a failed suicide attempt. After the horrific night of crime on July 13, 1966, Daniel Scott, the perpetrator of the massacre at the student dormitory, felt completely exhausted and unable to face the consequences of his actions. On July 17, 1966, just a few days after the massacre, Scott decided to end his life. In a state of panic and despair, he went to a cheap motel in Chicago where he had been staying for the previous several days. Scott locked the door to his room, sat down on the edge of the bed and used a small knife to cut his wrists. He hoped that death would be an escape from the haunting and guilt he could not escape. The cuts along his arms caused Scott to lose a lot of blood. Fortunately, however, he was discovered in time. A motel manager, after hearing strange noises coming from Scott's room, called the police and an ambulance. He was taken to a nearby hospital, where doctors immediately tended to his wounds. While being treated at the hospital, a doctor noticed a distinctive tattoo on Scott's arm, specifically the words "Born to Raise Hell." This tattoo perfectly matched the description that Elena Garcia, the sole survivor of the massacre, had given of the perpetrator. The doctor immediately informed the police, who were quickly called to the hospital to verify the information. At this time, Scott was in a weak and panicked state, unable to defend himself or fight back. With the help of Elena's testimony, the police confirmed that Scott was the perpetrator of the massacre at the student dormitory. He was immediately arrested and taken into custody, facing charges of murder and atrocity. After Scott was arrested, the police began a thorough investigation to gather evidence for the case. They discovered additional important clues during their search, including physical evidence at the crime scene, torn pieces of clothing from the victims, and Scott's footprints in other areas of the house. Scott admitted to his actions during a brief interrogation, but tried to clear his name by claiming that he had no intention of killing and only wanted to teach the girls a lesson after an argument with them. However, with the clear and undeniable evidence, no one believed his defense. In April 1967, the Daniel Scott case went to trial in a Chicago, Illinois court. The trial attracted a great deal of public and media attention, as Scott's massacre had become one of the most gruesome crimes in the city's history. With overwhelming evidence and powerful testimony from Elena Garcia, the sole survivor of the massacre, prosecutors easily built a strong case against Scott. Elena Garcia, despite her horrific ordeal, stood firm and gave a powerful and detailed account of what she witnessed that night. She accurately described Scott's appearance, the distinctive tattoos on his arms, and his actions during the massacre. Elena's testimony was key to the police identifying and arresting Scott. With the overwhelming evidence, including Scott's DNA, fabric, and prints at the scene, plus his signature tattoo matching Elena's description, Daniel Scott had no way to escape. After a lengthy trial, on April 25, 1967, Scott was sentenced to death for murder with especially brutal circumstances. Scott's death sentence was considered a fair punishment for what he had done. The court also emphasized that Scott's actions were premeditated, barbaric, and unforgivable. The victims' loved ones, especially those who had lost their daughters in the massacre, felt some measure of reconciliation through the sentence, although the pain and loss were still unbearable. Scott's death sentence, however, did not last long. In 1972, a landmark decision by the United States Supreme Court sent shockwaves through the Illinois and national justice systems. The court ruled that the death penalty in Illinois violated the United States Constitution, particularly in terms of cruel and unjust treatment of the condemned. The decision came in the case of Furman, Georgia, in which the Supreme Court stated that the death penalty must be applied fairly and not arbitrarily. Scott's death sentence was overturned shortly thereafter, and his sentence was commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This caused controversy among the public, especially among the families of the victims and the public, who felt that Scott deserved to pay with death for his brutality. Sentenced to life in prison, Scott was sent to an Illinois prison, where he continued to face life in solitary confinement. He was unable to leave, had no contact with the outside world, and had limited access to other people. Life in prison became a prolonged sentence for Scott, who could now only live in solitude and come to terms with the crimes he had committed. The Supreme Court's decision in 1972 had a profound impact, not only on Scott, but also on the American legal system. Many believe that the decision paved the way for a major shift in the use of the death penalty in states across the country. In the years that followed, many states suspended executions, while others began to reconsider the appropriateness and fairness of the punishment. For the families of the victims, the decision was a fresh wound in their grief. Although Scott still faced life in prison, many felt that justice was not served completely when their son's killer was not given the death penalty. In the years since his life sentence, Daniel Scott has lived the life of a dangerous criminal in prison. He has shown no remorse for his actions and remains indifferent and emotionless when talking about the massacre. In later interviews, Scott continued to appear cold and unrepentant. Years after his conviction, Scott remains one of the most notorious criminals in Illinois prisons. He is considered by guards and other inmates to be a prime example of the cruelty and insensitivity of the criminal world. In 1996, the American public was shocked when a videotape from 1988 was released to the public at Stateville Prison. It was a long tape recording the image of Daniel Scott while serving his sentence in prison. This tape immediately attracted attention and shocked public opinion, because in it, Scott showed an indifferent, cold attitude and no remorse for the crimes he had committed. In the tape, Scott appeared with long hair, signs of breast growth due to hormone use, and wearing women's underwear, showing a life that was not only abnormal, but also full of depraved behavior in prison. These scenes showed Scott performing sexual activities, not only with himself, but also engaging in illegal relationships with other prisoners. This image created a disturbing and perverted image, making people feel extremely disgusted and confused about Scott's condition during his imprisonment. However, what really shocked and horrified the public was not Scott's dress or his behavior in prison, but his reaction when asked about the massacre he had committed. When asked about the victims of the massacre on July 13, 1966, Scott simply smiled faintly and responded with a statement that showed his absolute indifference to the deaths of 8 innocent women.
It just wasn't their night.
This was a short answer, but clearly reflected Scott's cold mentality. He seemed to have no remorse for his cruel actions. To him, the lives of the victims were just an unfortunate coincidence, an event that he felt no guilt about. A prisoner in the prison later asked Scott,
"How did you feel after killing all those women?"
Scott replied coldly,
Like I always did. Nothing.
and continued.
If you ask me if I feel remorse, I don't.
This was an answer that confirmed Scott's complete indifference to the deaths he had caused. He had no regrets or remorse, and that only added to the disgust people felt toward him. What made the tape even more outrageous was Scott's boastful and enjoyable attitude about life in prison. While his victims lost their lives forever, Scott showed no remorse for his actions. On the contrary, he appeared smug and defiant, even saying,
If they only knew how much fun I was having, they'd turn me loose.
Scott's statement caused strong anger and indignation among the public when he described his life in prison as a vacation while his victims paid with their lives in a night of terror. Scott's indifference and defiance towards justice have made many people question the state of the prison system in the U.S., whether it really ensures rehabilitation or is just a place for people like Scott to continue living in selfishness and coldness. Scott's story and the videotape have shocked and raised many important questions about the American correctional and judicial systems. Are criminals like Scott simply becoming shadows living in prison without facing any real punishment for the crimes they have committed? This question has been asked not only by the public, but also by experts and critics that criticize the country's correctional system. The videotape not only sheds light on Scott's indifference to his victims, but also highlights the failure of the correctional system. Scott has not only remained unchanged, but has also been complacent in a life of irresponsibility. The correctional system has not helped Scott realize the seriousness of his crimes. On the contrary, it is an environment that allows people like him to continue to evade responsibility and live lives of pleasure. After the release of the tape, many expressed deep concern about the consequences it could have on society. The debates about the death penalty, appropriate punishment for crimes, and the ability to reform criminals became more heated than ever. Public opinion believed that, with Scott's actions and words, it was clear that the U.S. correctional system was not doing its job of reintegrating criminals into society, but instead, it simply kept them in a state of indifference and indifference. Legal experts and human rights activists have argued that it is necessary to recognize and treat people like Scott with more seriousness. Otherwise, those who commit terrible crimes like him may never realize the seriousness of their actions and will continue to harm society. Ultimately, Scott's case and the videotape became a symbol of the failure to provide justice and rehabilitation for dangerous criminals, raising major questions about the ability of the justice and correctional systems to effect real change in offenders. The Daniel Scott case profoundly changed perceptions of safety, especially in dormitories and medical facilities. It also reignited debates about the death penalty, criminal rehabilitation, and psychological research. Scott became a prime example of the failure to rehabilitate a serial killer. His case left a horrifying mark on American criminal history, a clear demonstration of brutality and inhumanity. Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this story and want to dive deeper into more intriguing mysteries, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update.